Hello everyone. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and let's go.
Jason Clarke sank into the soft business class seat of the airplane, enjoying a rare moment of silence. Over the past 3 days, his life had been a whirlwind of meetings, presentations, and deal-making. All of that was behind him, however, and he was looking forward to returning home. Jason's gaze fell involuntarily to the screen of his phone, where a picture of his beloved wife, Amelia, was displayed. She was smiling, her long brown hair tumbling over her shoulders, her eyes shining with the warmth he loved so much. Their 5-year wedding anniversary was just 2 days away, and Jason had prepared thoroughly. He'd planned a romantic weekend at a resort hotel, and he'd picked out Amelia's jewelry, a dainty sapphire necklace that he was going to pick up tomorrow. He wanted to make this moment special by reminding his wife how much she meant to him. But something was bothering him. Before landing, he tried calling Amelia to let her know he was coming, but her phone sent him to voicemail. He then tried the landline at home, but again without success. Jason knew that Amelia sometimes left her phone in the car or forgot to charge it. Still, a sense of unease crept into his thoughts. The plane was gaining altitude, and Jason tried to distract himself by opening his laptop. He wrote a few notes about the deal that had just been signed, but soon closed the file, unable to concentrate. His gaze fell back to his phone, where there were still no notifications from Amelia. Landing in his hometown, he hurried to the luggage belt, grabbed his suitcase, and headed for the parking lot. In the car, he dialed Amelia's number again. Voicemail again. His fingers gripped the steering wheel a little harder than usual. Jason parked outside their cozy house in the suburbs. To his surprise, there was no Amelia's car in the driveway. The house looked quiet and empty, as if it hadn't been inhabited by anyone in a long time. She's probably out with her friends, he thought, pulling out his keys. Entering the house, he immediately noticed that everything inside was just as silent. The kitchen was in perfect order, no notes or messages on the refrigerator. He walked to the living room, tossed his suitcase on the floor, and reached for his phone. His gaze stopped at the window, beyond which the light of a street lamp cast long shadows across their lawn. At that moment, the phone vibrated in his hand. Amelia's number flashed on the screen. "Amelia? Where are you?" he asked, feeling the tension slowly subside. "Hello, Jason." Her voice sounded strangely light. "I'm sorry I didn't answer sooner. I was busy preparing a surprise for you." "Surprise?" He was surprised. "What surprise?" "It's a little party my friends and I organized. An early celebration of our anniversary," she explained. "You don't mind, do you?" Jason sensed a strange contradiction in her words. Amelia was usually incredibly attentive and loving. A surprise like this would seem out of character for her. "Of course I don't mind," he replied, trying not to show his concern. "Where will it be?" Amelia gave him the address. The place was unfamiliar to him, but he wrote it down, deciding to check it out later. "Dress casually," she added. "Just relax, you'll like it." Before ending the conversation, Jason noticed another oddity. Usually Amelia ended her calls with "love you," but this time she simply said, "see you later." Jason went upstairs, changed into jeans and a shirt, then entered the address into the navigator. His heart was beating a little faster than usual, and he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was just fatigue after the flight. Or maybe something in her voice sounded different than usual. The drive to the place took about 20 minutes. The neighborhood he entered looked unusual for Amelia's friends. Dark streets, dilapidated houses with peeling paint, and sparse streetlights creating a gloomy atmosphere. The navigator pointed to a house surrounded by a rusty fence. There were a few old cars and motorcycles in the yard. Jason parked and got out of the car. A feeling of unease swept over him, but he forced himself to take a deep breath and headed for the door. Before he knocked, he noticed that there was loud music playing in the house, muffled by the thick glass. The door opened a few seconds later. A large man stood on the threshold with a beer in his hand. His gaze was heavy and scrutinizing. "Yes," he asked briefly. "I'm Jason Clarke. Amelia said I should come here," he replied, feeling the tension inside become almost palpable. The man smirked, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "So you're Amelia's husband," he said, stepping aside. "Come in, we've been waiting for you." When Jason walked in, he felt like he'd taken a step into the unknown, from which there might be no turning back. The house Jason entered wasn't just unfriendly, it was menacing. The walls had peeling paint, The lighting was poor, and the loud music seemed to be displacing the air itself. The room smelled of tobacco, alcohol, and something acrid that made you want to cover your nose. "This way," Travis said briefly, pointing to the middle of the room. His voice was low, like a man accustomed to command. Jason noticed that the eyes of the others, Kevin, Robert, Alex, Mike, and Jake, were fixed on him. Their expressions were icy, almost indifferent, but with a touch of mockery. "Where's Amelia?" Jason asked, forcing his voice to sound firm, though his insides were clenched with anxiety. "She'll be here soon," Travis said with a grin. He nodded at the old wooden chair in the center of the room. "Sit down." "I'm not going to," Jason started, but Travis interrupted him, stepping closer. "Sit down, I said," he repeated, his voice becoming menacingly quiet. Assessing the situation, Jason decided to comply. He sat down in the chair, but immediately felt someone's rough hands on his wrists. He tried to resist, but was outnumbered. His hands were tied behind his back and his legs were secured to the legs of the chair. "What the hell is this?" Jason shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "Calm down, buddy," Alex muttered, nodding toward the door. "The show's about to start." The door opened, and Amelia entered the room. Her appearance struck Jason like a bolt of lightning, a short red dress with a low neckline, high-heeled shoes. This was not the wife he'd known and loved, but a woman who looked like she'd stepped off the cover of a men's magazine, bold, provocative, and beautiful. "Amelia, what's going on?" Jason shouted, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and confusion. She stopped in front of him, folded her arms across her chest, and stared intently into his eyes. "Do you want to know what's going on?" Her voice was cold, almost icy. "I've decided to teach you a lesson, Jason." "A lesson? For what?" His voice shook, not from fear, but from incomprehension. Amelia pulled a photograph out of her purse and threw it on the floor in front of him. The picture showed him sitting in a restaurant with Lily. "Is this your business trip?" she asked dismissively. Jason realized what was going on, and his voice exploded with indignation. "This is my sister, Lily. You know that very well." But Amelia wasn't listening. She grinned, shaking her head as if she were facing the most pathetic liar in the world. "Stop lying," she said. "You're going to get what you deserve tonight." She walked over to Travis and slowly put her arm around his shoulder. "You cheated on me, Jason. Now it's my turn." Jason felt rage boiling up inside him, but he was powerless to do anything about it. Amelia flirted with Travis, her fingers sliding down his chest. Then she turned to the other men in the room. "Who's next?" she asked, her voice full of challenge. The room filled with resounding laughter. The men glanced around, clearly enjoying the moment. Jason couldn't believe his eyes. He thought he was in some twisted nightmare from which there was no escape. "Amelia, stop!" he shouted, jerking his cords. "You're crazy." She turned to him with an icy grin. "Crazy? No, Jason. You're the one who drove me to it." Jason tried desperately to free himself, but the ropes were too tight. He watched as Amelia continued her show, sinking deeper and deeper into the abyss of humiliation she had created. Her words, her gestures, the laughter of the men all pierced his heart. Travis put his arms around her, then pulled her closer. The other men stood around, watching her move fluidly as if in a dance, her every gesture filled with outright provocation. "You could have prevented this if you had been honest with me," she continued, her voice sounding like the rustling of snake rings. Travis began to pull down Amelia's dress, leaving her almost completely naked. She looked at Jason over her shoulder, her eyes glittering with defiance. "Isn't this what you wanted?" she asked, her voice sounding challenged. She walked over to Robert, pulled him by the collar, and started kissing him right in front of Jason. The other men laughed, moving closer as if they were going to share this moment. Amelia and the men began to move in some crazy, chaotic harmony, their laughter echoing off the walls. He could see her hands touching theirs, their hands reaching for her. Every gesture they made, every movement she made cut into his heart, turning his feelings into a pain that was impossible to describe. His gaze fell on her face. She was no longer the woman he'd known. There was something predatory in her smile, her eyes glittering with cold joy at his humiliation. "You always wanted me to be the center of attention, Jason," she whispered, her voice sounding right in his ears, as if she were right next to him. "Well, here it was. Watch." When their fun was finally over, Jason was breathing heavily, tied to a chair in the center of the room. The ropes crashed into his wrists, every movement causing sharp pain. The room continued to fill with the laughter of Travis and his company. Their taunts seemed louder than the rock music coming from the old tape recorder on the floor. Amelia sat on the edge of the table. She looked at him with an expression of cold triumph. "Did you think you could fool me, Jason?" she said, pouring herself a glass of wine that one of the men had poured for her. "Now you know what it's like to feel helpless." Jason tried to deal with the anger and despair that came with it. Everything was boiling inside, but his mind was desperately searching for a way out. His self-defense training popped into his head, reminding him that even in a situation like this, there were ways to fight. He needed time. "Amelia," he said, trying to make his voice firm. "You're wrong. You've seen the picture, but you don't know the whole story. That's Lily, my sister." Amelia grinned, took a big sip of wine, and turned to Travis. "Did you hear that? That's his sister. Great excuse, don't you think?" Travis laughed, overlapping her words. "Jason, relax. She may be a sister, but you've already lost." The men glanced around, preparing for the next act of their humiliating show. But Jason knew this was his only chance. While they were distracted, he began to move his wrists, slowly loosening the tension of the ropes. Carefully, millimeter by millimeter, he tried to free his hands. Amelia, noticing his silence, leaned closer. "Nothing to say?" Her voice became a whisper filled with contempt. "Where's your boasted confidence?" Jason glanced up at her. His gaze was cold and focused. "You still don't know what you're doing, Amelia," he said, holding back the tremor in his voice. "But soon you will." Her face contorted in bewilderment for a moment, but she looked away, pretending not to care what he said. Meanwhile, Travis and Kevin were discussing something at the door, while Alex and Mike were arguing over a bottle of beer. Neither of them paid any attention to Jason. His hands finally slipped out of the ropes. Trying not to attract attention, he flexed his fingers, checking to see if they were still sensitive. Then, in a matter of seconds, he ripped the ropes from his legs. The first blow hit Alex, who was closest to him. Jason rose sharply and elbowed him in the jaw, sending him tumbling to the floor. A moment later, he grabbed the chair he was sitting on and threw it at Travis, knocking him off balance. "What the hell?" Travis screamed, struggling to stay on his feet. Kevin lunged at Jason, but he dodged, grabbed an empty bottle from a nearby table, and smashed it over his attacker's head. Shards of glass fell to the floor, and Kevin collapsed next to Alex. Mike was faster than the others. He headed toward Jason. "You think you're a hero?" he shouted, swinging. Jason stepped back, dodging, and punched Mike sharply in the stomach. He bent in half. "No one should have gotten hurt," Jason said. "But you chose this." At that moment, the door to the room opened, and two neighbors burst in, attracted by the noise. One of them was a large man who immediately shouted, "What's going on here?" Travis, trying to recover from the blow, tried to get away, but his neighbor grabbed him by the shoulder. "Don't move, buddy. The police are on their way." Amelia stood still, her face pale. She looked at Jason with an expression of horror and confusion. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," she whispered, but her voice had lost all of its venom. "You're right," Jason cut her off, looking at her with cold determination. "But this isn't the end, darling, it's just the beginning." A few minutes later, the room was filled with the sound of sirens. Police officers rushed into the house, breaking up those who were still trying to resist. Detective Harris, a tall man with a hard stare, approached Jason. "Are you all right?" he asked, scrutinizing the scene. "I am now," Jason replied, struggling to stay on his feet. The detective looked at Amelia, who was being handcuffed. "Is she your wife?" Jason nodded. "She was. Not anymore." Harris pressed his lips together and nodded, signaling the officers to continue. "We're going to need your help with the investigation," he said. "This looks like it was carefully planned." Jason leaned against the nearest table, barely able to stand. His breathing was ragged, and his hands were still shaking from the strain. He looked around the room, shards of glass, overturned chairs, and the motionless bodies of his attackers. It was a picture of chaos, but he was glad it was over. "Are you sure you're all right?" Detective Harris asked again, stepping closer. "I think so," Jason answered, though his voice sounded muffled. "I need some water." One of the policemen handed him a bottle of water, and Jason greedily drank several gulps. His mind slowly cleared. "Tell me what happened here," Harris said, pulling out a notebook. "Start from the beginning." Jason nodded and, leaning on the table, began to recount. He described Amelia's invitation to the party, the strange behavior, the threats from Travis and his group, and how they tied him up, forcing him to watch the humiliating show. His voice shook as he spoke of their taunts and Amelia's betrayal. Harris listened intently, nodding but not interrupting. "And then," Jason continued, "I realized that no one could help me but myself. I managed to free myself and protect myself." Harris took notes, then glanced at the other officers. "We need to gather all of this as evidence. Pay special attention to this woman's cell phone and camera footage," he said, pointing to a stationary video camera on a tripod in the corner of the room. Jason glanced at it and felt a new surge of anger. "They were recording all of this?" he asked, disbelieving his eyes. "It looks like it," Harris said. "We'll check to see exactly what was filmed, but it could be a key piece of evidence." Amelia was being led to the police car. She looked confused, but was still trying to maintain her pride. As she passed Jason, her eyes met his. "This is all your fault," she whispered, her voice full of hate. "No, Amelia," he answered quietly, but there was an icy resolve in his voice. "It's your choice." She turned away, her face red with anger, and was ushered into the car. Harris, having finished his questioning, gave Jason a moment to catch his breath. Then he came over again. "Do you have someplace to go?" he asked. "You don't want to stay here." "I'm going home," Jason answered, though he wasn't sure how he was going to deal with his emotions. "We have one more question," Harris added. "Do you want to apply for her?" Jason was silent for a moment, considering the question. "Yes," he said firmly. "I want her and those bastards to answer for everything they've done." Harris nodded. "We'll get back to you as soon as we're ready to investigate further. For now, you need to get some rest." One of the officers helped Jason out of the house. He got into his car, closed his eyes, and sighed heavily. Everything that had happened seemed unreal. His life had just been turned upside down, and he knew he had a long and difficult road ahead of him. But one thing was certain: he would never again let anyone, not even Amelia, control his destiny. Jason sat at the kitchen table in his home. The light of the only lamp reflected in a cup of cold coffee. Barely rested after the previous night's events, he tried to collect his thoughts. For the first time in a long time he felt free, but that freedom was bitter. A mixture of anger, humiliation, and determination to find the truth raged inside him. The laptop lay on the desk in front of him, open on the email screen. Jason searched for any trace that might help him understand how deep Amelia had gotten into this sordid adventure. He typed in the password to her old account, the one she'd been using for years. The system let him in surprisingly easily. The inbox turned out to be a veritable treasure trove of dark secrets. Among the many messages about purchases, bills, and mailings, Jason found correspondence with an unfamiliar address. The title of the email, sent a few days ago, made his heart stop for a moment. "Confirmation of appointment. Your personal service is scheduled." He opened the message. It contained a detailed description of the service provided by the mercenary group. The sender's name was hidden behind an alias, but the contents of the email left no doubt. Amelia, through a dubious website, had purposely hired people to humiliate him. Among the attachments were several screenshots of their correspondence, where Amelia described her desires. Jason felt his fingers clench into a fist. In one of the messages, she demanded that the humiliation be public and unforgettable. "Damn it," he muttered, feeling the rage boiling in his chest. He began downloading files to the flash drive, knowing that this could be important evidence. But that was just the beginning. He noticed another file signed as Private Investigator's Report. "What else have you been hiding?" he said quietly, opening the document. Inside was the report of the private investigator Amelia had hired to follow him on his trip to Seattle. The report detailed his encounters with Lily, including pictures from the restaurant. The document was crystal clear: it was indeed his sister, and there was no evidence of cheating. Jason closed his eyes and took a deep breath, realizing how far Amelia had gone. She knew the truth. Knew he hadn't cheated on her. But even then, she was determined to destroy their relationship. His musings were interrupted by the sound of the phone. It was Detective Harris. Jason, it's Harris. We're just going over the videotape we found in that house. Can I come over to your place to discuss the details? Sure, Jason answered. Come on over. Half an hour later, Harris appeared on the doorstep. He was holding a small folder, and his expression told me that the news was not going to be pleasant. We have evidence to prove that this is not the first case involving your wife and this group, Harris began, sitting down at the table. The video we found shows that Travis and the others used the same scheme with other men. Other men? Jason frowned. Yes, Harris nodded. The video evidence shows that your wife was an active participant in several of these situations. Jason felt his insides turn upside down. And that's not all. We found their correspondence on her cell phone. She deliberately hired these people through a website specializing in such services. We have evidence that she was aware of their methods and consented to the recording. The detective handed him copies of the correspondence and photos. Jason turned pale as he read the lines in which Amelia described how she wanted to put her husband in his place. She knew it wasn't my fault, he whispered. She had that detective's report, and she went ahead with it anyway. Exactly, Harris said. And now you have every reason to sue her. Jason put the papers down on the table and looked at the detective. What do you want me to do next? First, get a good lawyer, Harris said. This material will help you not only in the divorce, but also in the criminal case against her and her accomplices. Jason nodded. Thank you, Harris. I'll do whatever it takes. After the detective left, he spent the rest of the day gathering documents and calling Sarah Johnson's attorney. He knew he had a long and painful trial ahead of him, but he was sure he wouldn't stop until Amelia and her accomplices were held accountable for what they'd done. The legal process stretched over several months, and each new day brought Jason a mixture of relief and pain. He witnessed the justice system methodically dismantle the lives of Amelia, Travis, and their accomplices. The charges against them were numerous and severe: violence, conspiracy, defamation, and participation in the creation and distribution of degrading videos. The courtroom was filled with the buzz of reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers. Jason sat in the front row, his face impassive but a hurricane of emotion boiling inside him. He had come for truth and justice, but that didn't mean it was easy for him to see everything that had once been his life razed to the ground. The prosecutor delivered the last word, convincingly arguing that the actions of Amelia and her accomplices not only destroyed lives, but were part of a massive scheme to humiliate and exploit innocent victims. The footage presented as evidence left the audience shocked and outraged. As the judge announced the verdict, the hall filled with tense silence. Travis Williams, Robert Jenkins, Kevin Harris, Alex Brooks and Michael Scott, the judge began, his voice firm and impartial. I sentence each of you to 15 years in prison, with parole eligibility in no more than 10 years. He turned to Amelia next. Amelia Clark, the judge paused, as if letting her realize the seriousness of her actions. You have been found guilty of conspiracy, false accusations, violence, and moral injury to your husband and other victims. I sentence you to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after no sooner than 7 years. Amelia raised her head, her face pale, but she remained silent. The court also orders the defendants to recover $2 million in compensation to be distributed among the victims, the judge added, addressing the site's representatives. The operators of the site are obliged to close the resource and stop any activity related to the exploitation of personal data. The court's decision was final, and as Amelia was led away from the courtroom, Jason felt faint relief for the first time in a long time. It was the end of her control over his life, but he knew that the fight for recovery was just beginning. A few weeks later, Jason sat in the office of his attorney, Sarah Johnson. She handed him a check, the amount on which gave him conflicting feelings. You deserve this, Jason, Sarah said. It's not only compensation for everything you've been through, but also an opportunity to start a new life. Thank you, he replied, tucking the check into his briefcase. The money couldn't give him back the years and trust he'd lost, but it gave him a chance to put the past behind him. Jason's house had become his safe haven. He'd gotten rid of everything that reminded him of Amelia, their shared photos, gifts, belongings. He'd even repainted the walls in light, warm colors to erase the dark memories. But despite these changes, the past wouldn't let him go. Every night he went to bed with thoughts of what he could have done differently. His dreams often took him back to the house where he was bound, forcing him to relive moments of humiliation. He began seeing Dr. Evans, a psychologist recommended by Sarah. Trauma doesn't disappear overnight, she said in one of her sessions. But step by step, you can take control of your life back. Jason tried to follow her advice. He started exercising, returned to the self-defense training that had helped him that night, and even got a dog to fill his home with life. One evening he was sitting on his porch watching the sun set when his phone vibrated. It was Harris. "Jason, we've completed our investigation of the site," the detective said. "Thanks to your testimony and the evidence you provided, we were able to stop their activities. Now they have no chance of starting it up again." "That's good to hear," Jason replied. "Thanks for everything, Harris." He put the phone down and looked up at the sky. There wasn't a single cloud, just bright stars. He felt light for the first time in a long time. Jason set the mug on the table and opened his laptop. A worksheet appeared on the screen. Since he'd left his old job, he'd become a consultant in the IT industry. The freelance schedule allowed him more time to focus on himself and his recovery. His life was moving slowly, but it was exactly what he needed. Therapy with Dr. Evans helped him to look at his experiences as a phase that could be overcome, rather than the end of everything. Her main advice, however, was not to avoid socializing with people. That evening, returning from self-defense training, Jason found a note on his door. It had been left by his neighbor Madeline, a young elementary school teacher who had recently moved into the house across the street. "Jason, thanks for lending me the gardening tools. If you're home tomorrow night, come over for dinner. I'll cook something delicious. Madeline." Jason stared at the note for a few seconds, wondering if he should accept the invitation. He still had trouble getting close to people, especially after the betrayal, but something about Madeline's handwriting and the smile he noticed when they crossed paths convinced him to say yes. The next evening he stood on her doorstep with a bottle of red wine. The door opened, and Madeline greeted him in a cozy flannel shirt that emphasized her natural simplicity. "Come in, Jason," she said with a smile, gesturing invitingly to the candlelit table. Dinner was unexpectedly easy. Jason was surprised at how quickly he relaxed in her company. She told funny stories about her students, and he shared some stories from his work. It was normal, human companionship, devoid of drama, and it brought him more comfort than he'd expected. As the weeks passed, Jason began to feel his life take on a kind of stability. His home became a symbol of a new beginning. He tended the garden, added a tiny greenhouse by the window, and even started painting. These small activities helped him deal with his anxiety. At one of the sessions, Dr. Evans asked him an important question. "Jason, what makes you feel alive?" He thought about it. The answer turned out to be simple but powerful. "Movement," he said. "When I exercise, run, tend the garden, or just walk with Max." The doctor nodded. "Keep moving. It will help you find the rhythm of your life." From that day on, Jason started running every morning. It became his ritual that filled him with energy and confidence. One day he met Madeline in the park, where she was walking her retriever. They ran a few laps together and then stopped at a sidewalk cafe for a cup of coffee. "You should try the marathon," she said, noticing his improved form. "Maybe someday," he replied with a smile. A few months passed. One evening, while going through the mail, Jason came across a letter from Lily. His sister suggested they meet up and go on a beach picnic together to celebrate her birthday. He agreed, excited about the opportunity to spend time with his family. At the picnic, he met Lily's friends, including Jenna, an energetic and artistic woman who immediately caught his eye. Her directness and openness became an unexpected source of inspiration for him. They began to communicate. Gradually, without rushing, Jason felt able to trust again. Jenna didn't resemble Amelia, and that was her greatest asset. She was natural, caring, and didn't try to control him. Sitting on the veranda of his house one evening, Jason watched Madeline and her retriever play outside. Max lay lazily at his feet. He thought about the path he had traveled, how a life seemingly shattered to the ground could be rebuilt if given a chance. His cell phone vibrated. It was Jenna. "Hey, Jason. How are you?" "Better than ever," he replied, smiling. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could face them head-on. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.